want to tell you something. I have a friend who shall remain nameless. Let me see if you guys can handle this. I don't know, but this friend has never actually seen Star Wars. I know. It's shocking. He's never seen the original series. He's never seen the prequels. He's not even seen the new Star Wars. Never seen Star Wars. And I know you're thinking, Jared, you're a horrible friend. Why haven't you introduced him to Star Wars? And the thing is, he has absolutely no desire to see them. He thinks the idea is stupid. He's like, it looks stupid. I don't want to see it. It's stupid. Okay, yada-da-da-da, space opera, whatever. I don't want to see that. Okay, and I know that's shocking, but I was starting to think about this, and I can't be too critical. Well, let me back up a little bit. Anybody who knows me knows that probably my two favorite things when I'm not working or doing things is music and movies. I love music and I love movies. When I have free time, I love to watch movies. I love all kinds of movies. I love classic movies, all those things, okay? So I started to think about this, and he's never seen Star Wars, but I started to think there's a lot of classic movies that I've never seen. For instance, I've never seen Lawrence of Arabia. I've never seen Singing in the Rain. Okay, I can sing I know the songs, okay, but I've never actually seen it myself. I've never seen Sunset Boulevard. I've never actually sat down from beginning to end and watched The Sound of Music. I know. Now, I probably have seen the movie in pieces throughout my life, but I've never actually watched the whole film. Now, the prime example of this for me was Casablanca. I had never seen Casablanca. Now, here's the thing. The funny thing about all these movies is that I could tell you the plot. I've probably quoted lines from it. I could tell you what year they were released. I could tell you when they won Best Picture. I could tell you all these things about these movies, but I'd never actually seen Casablanca. I know it's Humphrey Bogart. I know it's Ingrid Bergman. I know the whole thing, but I'd never actually seen it. So, right, there's a movie theater here in town that'll show like revivals of, once a week they'll show a classic movie. So I went, Angie and I, we had dinner, and we went and we watched Casablanca in a movie theater. And anybody who's seen it, I don't have to tell you, it's phenomenal. It's a great movie. But the funny thing about it was that it wasn't really what I expected. You know what I mean? It was, because I thought I knew. I was expecting kind of this melodramatic love story, with Humphrey Bogart with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and Ingrid Bergman looking at him longingly for like 2 hours. That was pretty much what I was expecting. But it was funny. It was really funny. It was like part comedy, part action movie, and then love story kind of as a third. And not at all what I expected. And then all the lines that I knew, that I quoted, here's looking at you, kid, play it again, Sam, this is the start of a beautiful friendship, all these classic lines, were never in the context or in the place that I thought they would be. They were like in different moments, like this is the start of a beautiful friendship. Actually, Bogart doesn't say that to the girl. He says it to the French policeman. I'm like, what? Okay, that's not at all what I expected. And the line, play it again, Sam, actually does not appear in Casablanca anywhere. It's kind of one of those misquotes that people do. Okay, now just for the record, I didn't come here to do a film appreciation class tonight. That was not really the point, but here's what sparked this. Last week we began a series called Attitude Adjustment, and we are talking about the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And we're looking specifically at a specific portion called the Beatitudes. And a friend of mine that was here last week, he came up to me afterwards and he said that it was really interesting because he'd been in church for years and years and years throughout his life, but he'd never actually heard anybody teach on the Sermon on the Mount. And it really got me to thinking. I started to think about it. I was like, when was the last time that I heard someone teach the Sermon on the Mount? And I swear to you, I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember the last time that I heard somebody actually teach from the Sermon on the Mount. And I realized that Jesus, the life of Jesus and his teachings frequently become like Casablanca. They're these things that we know. They're part of our collective cultural consciousness. We quote them. We know the plot, right? We definitely know the plot. But how often do we actually read it? How often do we actually experience it? How often do we actually study it for ourselves. Because when we do, when you actually read it for yourself, you'll find that, well, maybe there's some things in there that you didn't know were there. Or maybe some of the things that you quote are in different places and in different contexts than what you expect. And you wouldn't know that unless you actually read it for yourself. And so I think we have to beware, especially with Jesus, that this classic movie syndrome with him, that we think we know it, but we never actually take the time to sit down and read it and experience it for ourselves. So that's why I'm so excited that we're starting the year off with this series called Attitude Adjustment, where we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, specifically looking at the first portion called the Beatitudes. Everybody say Beatitudes. And a beatitude is an attitude you should be. Say it to your neighbor. A beatitude is an attitude you should be. That's a pretty simplistic way to go about it. A beatitude, we learned last week, the word actually means happy. It means content. And we spent the first portion of last week really talking about the importance of the Sermon on the Mount. Like, why is it important for us to study it? Why is it such a big deal? Why are 3 chapters of Matthew's gospel dedicated to this one message? And one of the things I was thinking about this week in preparation was that, to really put it in context, is you always have to remember that Jesus began his ministry at the age of 30. Okay? Everything that he did that's documented, all the miracles, all the teachings, everything happened in 3 years, from the time he was 30 to he was 33. So 30 years of human life he had before he opened his mouth and began to teach anybody that we know of. 30 years of success, so 30 years of failures, 30 years of trials and tribulations, 30 years of dealing with family, right? Amen? 30 years of dealing with the weird uncle and aunt that come and visit twice a year, right? Don't point. 30 years of life, 30 years of dealing with death and tragedy, all of this that he experienced before he ever opened his mouth and started to teach. And he took all of that experience, living in Israel, living in Egypt, everything that he did, learned in the 40-day fast that he had right before he started teaching. He took all of this experience of life and he boiled it down into this message that he's about to give to the human race. These were not just some ideas off the top of his head. These were things that he had tried. He'd experienced. These were things that he had learned throughout his life and actually put into practice for himself. These just weren't theoretical ideas, and he's like, I wonder. He'd actually lived this message that he was about to teach. So when he did teach it, he could teach it with confidence. He could teach it with surety in himself, that it wasn't just some spiritual concept, but instead it was a real life way to live. And that's the power of the Sermon on the Mount, that this is a man of 30 who's waited his entire life to accumulate this knowledge so that he could pass it on to us. It's pretty cool stuff. So, the first thing that Jesus comes to us and tells us is he says, blessed. Blessed or happy. Blessed translates to mean happy. And I think if we're going to proceed on in the rest of this series, I think that we kind of have to shift, if we can, our understanding of what the word happy means. Okay? Because in our culture, we live in the 20th, 21st century culture, so happy means comfort, right? Happy means pleasure. I'm happy because I have a funnel cake, right? Right? Does anything make you happier than a funnel cake? I mean, think about it. It is the quintessential happy food. Am I the only one with this? Who loves funnel cakes? Okay, good. I didn't think I was. I mean, it's impossible to cry and eat a funnel cake. I don't care what's happened to you. You can't weep and eat a funnel cake. That's just physically impossible. Okay, but happiness is connected to something we do. I'm happy because I'm at Disney World. I'm happy because I have money. I'm happy because I got a new car. I'm happy because something is happening to me that is good, right? And I think that's really our culture in a nutshell, right? Is to pursue comfort and pleasure at all cost. But here's the problem, is that, well, what happens when you're uncomfortable? You're not happy. And what kind of life is that? Because can we be honest, at least half the time in this life, we're going to be uncomfortable. We're not going to be receiving the pleasure or the comfort that we think that we want. So that means if we set up our happiness and our contentment based on our comfort and our pleasure, then that means that half of our lives, at least, we're going to be unhappy. That's not a really good way to live, is it? So we have to shift this thinking of what it means to be happy. See, Jesus, being incredibly intelligent and insightful about the human condition, begins his entire message with this word, blessed, happy. Because he understands that at our core, human beings, we want to be happy, right? I mean, even our founding fathers knew that, right? That we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We understand at our core that we want to be happy, but this seems like an insipid idea to us now, because if we associate happiness with funnel cakes, then that just seems stupid, right? But here's the point. If happiness is beyond that, so Jesus understands that the human condition, we want to be happy, but he's also smart enough to know that he goes to the core of what it means to be human by trying to show us how to be happy and find contentment even when we are uncomfortable. There's the rub. How do you find contentment and happiness even when you are uncomfortable? Even when things don't go your way? I mean, because if your attitude is based on your circumstances, then half the time you're going to have a terrible attitude. Right? Isn't that why half the people you meet every day have a terrible attitude? Because they're the group of that day that things aren't going their way, right? So there you happen to find that person that day at the gas pump who is having a terrible day, so he has a terrible attitude. And tomorrow it might be the next person. It might be you. So if your situation and your attitude and your happiness is based on what is happening, then you're going to have a pretty bleak existence. See, happiness is more than what happens. Can I say that again? Happiness is more than what happens. But our culture teaches us that our happiness is contingent on what happens. But Jesus is coming and telling us that your happiness has to be based on more than what is happening to you. Does that make sense? So Jesus begins this message by showing us this beautiful thing. And he says that blessed, happy, are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus begins his entire message by saying, happy are people who are poor in spirit. And last week we realized, you know who's poor in spirit? All of us. We are rich in emotion. We are rich in thought. We are rich in desire and appetite, but we are po in spirit. Right, not poor. Now, we country folks, so we po in spirit, all right? We are po in spirit, and here's the cool thing. That's okay. You weren't designed to be rich in spirit. God made you poor in spirit, and he made a kingdom of heaven designed for folks just like us. The kingdom of heaven is designed for people who are poor in spirit. So the kingdom of heaven is designed for us. You see, religion, since its founding, religion has spent all of its time trying to convince human beings that we can become spiritual. That if you pray this many times, if you sing this many songs, if you make this journey or you meditate for this period of time, if you eat this food and you go to this and you read this, if you do all these things, then somehow you can shed all of this emotion and shed all of this thought and shed all of this appetite and desire, and you can transcend the human existence and ascend to a different level of spirituality. Yeah, right. Okay, sure. Temporarily, maybe, if you're lucky, until another human being comes your way and then, boom, burst your bubble, right? Because nothing blows your spirituality quicker than another person, right? But Jesus, the beauty of the message of Jesus and what separates Christianity and following Christ from every other belief system in the world is Jesus looks you straight in the eye and he says, you are not spiritual. You have a spirit, yes, but you are not spiritual. But guess what? You don't have to be, because that's not the way God made you. God made you to be poor in spirit, so then you would seek out your Father who's rich in spirit. Does anybody know what an oxymoron is? I personally love oxymorons. I think they're just about the funniest thing in the world. So I always try to spot them and see them in different places. For those of you who don't know, Lily's going to put the definition. It's a figure of speech in which apparently contradictory terms appear in conjunction. Okay, example would be classics, jumbo shrimp. Okay, it's jumbo, but it's a shrimp, so it doesn't really make sense. Another classic one, civil war. Right, that doesn't really make any sense. What's civil about war, right? You know, what's civil about war anyway? Does anybody have any favorites? Favorite oxymorons? Naval intelligence, yes. I've heard army intelligence, yes, yeah, those all work. Anybody else? Anybody else? I've got a few favorite ones. Do you mind if I share them? Found missing. Really? If you're found, then how could you be missing? Anyway, new classic. You heard this one all the time. This is a new classic. How can it be a classic if it's right? Okay, clearly misunderstood. This is a good one. Plastic glasses. Doesn't really make sense. This is a good one. Political science. Sorry, Billy. Sorry about that one. How about this? Tight slacks. First of all, the word slacks. Is there a grosser word in the world? Just say it. Say slacks. It just feels, I hate it. It's one of my least favorite words. Definitely maybe. If it's definite, then how could it be maybe? Okay. 12-ounce pound cake. If it's 12 ounces, how could it be a pound cake? I don't know. Working vacation, exact estimate. Yeah, you know, Scott knows about those exact estimates. And my favorite, Microsoft Works. I was thinking about these oxymorons this week when I was reading the Beatitudes, because some of these things that you read, they seem like they're just in direct, opposition of each other. They seem like they're these contrary ideas that are somehow supposed to be working in conjunction with one another. And the one that we're going to look at tonight is the prime example of this. If you want to read along with us, we're in Matthew, the 5th chapter, and we're going to be in verse number 4. We're just going to look at one verse tonight. And this is the second of the Beatitudes. And I'll be honest with you, I had intentions to do 2 Beatitudes tonight so we could kind of work our way through this month, but it didn't really work out that way. So I don't know why I told you that, but you don't really care. You're like, oh, really? Well, I feel gypped. I only got 1 Beatitude tonight. Can I get my money back? I need my deposit back. Thank you. Anyway, Matthew, the 5th chapter, verse number 4, it says, "Blessed are those who mourn." Stop right there. Happy are those who mourn. Doesn't that seem like an oxymoron? I mean, that does not sound like 2 ideas that should be in conjunction with one another. I'm sure everybody in here, one thing that everybody has in common is that we've all experienced loss, right? We've all lost someone that we love. And sometimes, we associate specifically mourning with a person dying, but sometimes we have to mourn many things. Sometimes it's an opportunity. Sometimes it's a job, relationships. Have you ever had to mourn the loss of a relationship? Sometimes it's expectation. You put your hope into something, and those hopes were dashed, and it takes you a period of time to grieve and to mourn that loss. Or a pet. Sometimes we feel embarrassed that we grieve sometimes the way we do. We're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't because it was just a pet. But have you ever had a pet that just knocked the wind out of your sails when it went away? And you feel weird, you don't want to tell people because you think that it makes you look silly, but it doesn't change the fact that you're grieving and you're mourning. See, as human beings, whenever we experience a loss, whenever something is taken from us, we grieve. There's a mourning, a grieving process that comes with it. And if you've ever experienced that, which I have many times, it's kind of hard to listen to Jesus sit here and look at you and say, happy are those who mourn. You're kind of like, really? Happy are those who mourn? Because I've been through this process and it wasn't, I don't get that. How does that work, Jesus? And I think it kind of goes back to two inherent problems. Number one, what our definition of happiness is, right? And the second thing is we have a really bad habit with the Bible of quoting portions of verses, right? The Beatitudes is really bad for this because people will just quote the first half. They'll say, blessed are the poor in spirit, or blessed are those who mourn, or blessed are the peacemakers. And they just quote that first half. But Jesus isn't making a statement that blessed are those who mourn, period. There's not a period there. That's not a statement. That's not a complete thought. It's part of a thought. And the Bible can be so dangerous when we quote verses out of context. One of the classic ones is people will say, all things work together for the good. That's not the end of that verse. There's some other things. All things work together for the good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. There's caveats and things that make the thought complete. But we like to just pick the one little part and just say the one part, when there's more of a thought to it. And blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. But so often we leave off the second half of that thought, which completes the idea. See, in the Beatitudes is a series of statements with an A portion and a B portion. It has a statement, and then it has a resolution. A statement and a resolution, and if you don't look at them together, then you're getting half of the story. So blessed are those who mourn. Why? For they shall be comforted. People aren't just happy because they're mourning. They don't find contentment just in mourning. They find contentment in mourning because they're comforted. Why are we blessed when we mourn? Because we feel comforted. Why are we blessed when we're poor in spirit? Because we have the kingdom of heaven. You can't separate the statement from the promise, from the because. I mean, because we're children. We're the children of God, right? And some of us are a little more childish than others, like me. I'm probably more in like that 6 or 7 year old range. You know, maybe some of you have ascended to the 10 or 11 year old range, but I'm a young guy. And as children, what do children do? They want to know why, right? Our kids want to know why. So, hey, Dad, hey, we're going to the store. Why? Why are we going to the store, Dad? To get some food. Why? Because we're hungry. Why? Because we need food. Why? Because we get energy. Why? Because we can do things. Why do we do things, Dad? Because we do. Right? Have you ever had this conversation with your kids or with like a niece or nephew? This endless series of questions. But that's our nature. But we've reached this point in church where we feel like that if we ask a question of God, somehow we're sacrilegious. If we look at God and say, hey, why? That he's going to go, how dare thee speak to me this way? I cast thee down. Right? You know, it really, if he's our heavenly Father and the kingdom of heaven is we're supposed to be children, then I would think that the most common question on our lips would be, why? So Jesus doesn't make these statements. He doesn't say, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, just without giving us a why. Why are we blessed when we're poor in spirit? Because we have the kingdom of heaven. Why are we blessed when we mourn? Because we will be comforted. There's an A and a B. There's a because. And don't ever think that God isn't willing to share with you the because. There's a reason, and he'll share. Don't be afraid to ask why, and also don't be afraid to listen to the answer. Now, I want to take the next couple of minutes, and I want to invite somebody up to talk for a few minutes, my lovely wife, Angela. And we're talking about this idea of mourning, and I didn't think that there was anybody that would be better to talk about it for a few minutes than have Angie talk about it and maybe share a little bit of her journey over the last couple of years that she's had. And she said she was willing to do it, so here she goes.
It's funny how your life can change. How one moment things can be one way, and the next moment, one phone call, everything changes. It was the summer of 2013. Things were good. I was just selected to be on the cover of my company's magazine to feature my success. And Isabella was completing her last show of a touring cast, and we were celebrating at a cast party. I got a phone call, and my world changed. It was my stepdad calling from California, screaming that my mother had had a heart attack and that she might be dead, and she was taken away in an ambulance. I went back into that pizza place. 1 minute, I was celebrating with my family, and one phone call later, my world had changed. I sat down quietly. I didn't want to show it on my face, what I had just learned. I was immediately going over scenarios. How could I get to California? How could I get there fast? How can I do that? I took a deep breath. It was too late in the day. I couldn't do anything now. Is this real? Was this just some nightmare that I just couldn't wake up from? My mother held on until I made it there to be by her side. She died peacefully at 69 years old, a month from her 70th birthday. I was there. I walked out of the hospital room. I couldn't go back in. She was no longer there. I walked outside, and I collapsed. My legs, they just refused to work. My body was rebelling. I stayed in California for 2 weeks to plan her funeral. I'm an only child, raised by my mother and my grandmother until I was 9 years old when my mom remarried and moved to California. In the process of planning my mother's funeral, I received word that my grandmother, at age 90, was in bad shape. 18 days after my mother died, my grandmother passed away. I flew to Ohio to be there for the funeral. Shock. I was still. I am not a still person. I move, I shake, I create, lest I feel like I'm not accomplishing anything, and that is unacceptable to me. I needed to keep going, to keep doing, but my body said no. I fought. I would wake up depressed, in a constant state of fuzzy words and people. I didn't want to get out of bed. I cried a lot. I lost my mom, my grandmother, the two most important women in my life. Gone. 4 months later, I found myself in California again, helping my stepdad sell his home and move closer to me. The phone rang. My biological father had had a stroke and was in the hospital. It was bad. Oh God, I know you don't give us more than we can handle. I can't handle this. I could not get to him. He passed away in Ohio from a stroke at age 67. I was an orphan. It was not real. How many funerals do I have to go to, Lord? What is your plan in this? I don't see it. I flew to Ohio to plan yet another funeral, handle another estate. It was bleak and cold. I was alone. I went a little mad. I couldn't hold it all together like I thought I could, like I tried to. Grief came out in so many different ways. The smallest thing would just take me down. I had to sit. The room would spin. My body would refuse to cooperate and allow me to continue. I only moved forward after I listened to my heart and stopped when the emotion came. Fighting was fruitless. I had to feel it. I had to go through it. You cannot escape it. I had panic attacks. If you try to stifle it, which I tried, it will then come out in other ways. Impatience, self-loathing, anger, sickness. Jared was with me. He reminded me what the Bible said. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I decided I was going to walk through this shadow. That I was not going to stop and set up a tent and stay there. I was walking. God was with me. This is only for a season. You will get through it. I just had to keep walking. I kept walking, doing what I knew how to do.
That, there's something about mourning that we try to avoid it, right? I mean, we don't want to deal with it. We try to avoid it at all costs. We try to act like it's no big deal. Have you ever had someone in your life that went through a tragedy and they're trying to put on the brave face? And they're trying to act like it's no big deal. No, I'm fine. And it's so phony, right? I mean, you can just see through it. It's the most transparent thing in the world. And you see it on other people, but for some reason we think when we do it, that it's totally fooling everybody. But it's not. It's not fooling anybody. And the thing we have to remember is that grief, it has no expiration date. If you avoid it, it doesn't go away. It just sits there and waits on the shelf until you're ready to deal with it. And the longer that you take to deal with it, the longer that you take to process it, the longer it takes for you to come to the conclusions and deal with it the way that you need to. But there's an interesting concept in this beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. There's something implied in here that I think is really important, and that is that if we don't mourn, we can't be comforted. If you think about it, if you don't mourn, you can't be comforted. And the last thing we want to do sometimes is actually grieve and actually allow ourselves to mourn the loss of something. And in so doing, we lock the door to comfort. So often we try to avoid grief at all costs, and in so doing, we just prolong the process. Many of you were here a few weeks ago. Who was here when my dad was here, when he ministered? Yeah. You may have heard him mention my brother, Joshua, that was hit and run by a car. Joshua was 8 years old in 1980 when he was hit by a car. And he suffered severe brain damage. He never regained his ability to speak. He never regained his ability to walk. He was basically in a fetal position and he survived for 6 years after the accident. Miracle after miracle, just his surviving. Every day that he took breath was a literal, tent revival miracle. I mean, it was like one of those crazy, it was unbelievable. The amount of damage that his body sustained, the fact that he was even alive was a miracle. And we celebrated that. And we took him with us everywhere that we went. And he survived for 6 years. So I was 4 years old when the accident happened, and I was 10 years old. It was June 7th, 1986. It was my birthday. And Joshua had come down with a severe pneumonia. So we took him to the hospital. And I remember my parents coming back from the hospital, and they sat down, and I saw the tears in my mom and dad's eyes. And they told us that Joshua had passed away. And I decided in that moment, in my 10-year-old mind, that I was going to be strong. You know what? I'm going to be strong. My family is hurting, so I am going to be strong. I am not going to cry. I'm not. I'm going to be the big boy. I'm going to be the pillar of strength for my family. And I wanted to be strong for them. I wanted to somehow convince my 10-year-old mind that we didn't need to be sad, that Josh was fine, that he was in heaven, that he was with Jesus, and it was all fine. Nobody needed to cry. So my dad, he looks over and he saw my stone-faced expression, and he gently asked me, he said, "Jared, what are you feeling?" And looking back on it now, I realized he didn't know. I mean, for all he knew, I was mad that it was my birthday and that my party was ruined or something stupid like that. I mean, he didn't know. I didn't care about any of that. But he didn't know, so he asked gently, and he was like, "Hey, what's wrong?" And I looked at him and I said, "I just want to be strong." And he looked back at me and he said these words, I'll never forget it. He said that sometimes being strong is being brave enough to show people that you hurt. Sometimes being strong is being brave enough to show that you hurt. And then he grabbed me. He took me in his arms and bear hugged me. And you saw my dad, he's a big guy, and I was 10, so I was swallowed up in his hug. And I broke. I fell apart. I broke and I cried like a 10-year-old boy should cry when his brother has just passed away. I cried and I cried. And I was comforted in the arms of my Father. I found comfort. Even in that moment, I was blessed. I was happy because I was content in the arms of my Father. But as long as I insisted on being strong, why would anyone ever comfort me? Why would that comfort ever come your way if you insist that you don't need it and that you're strong? Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. That's why we're blessed. That's why we're happy when we mourn, because that's when the floodgates are open to us for the people around us and those who love us to come and show us comfort. For our Heavenly Father to send the words and a song or an image that brings comfort to our soul. Have you ever been hurting and just that one thing will happen? You'll see something or a song will come on the radio and it'll just bring comfort to your heart. But you have to let yourself mourn. And again, we get fixated sometimes on people passing. Sometimes it's the small things that we don't let ourselves grieve and mourn over. It's the transitions in life. It's the hopes that we put in something. Sometimes it's a marriage. Sometimes it's a relationship. Sometimes it's a house that now has a foreclosed sign in front of it that represented dreams and hopes for a future that will never happen. And you have to let yourself mourn. Because only when you let yourself mourn can you find the happiness and the blessing of being comforted.